Now let me please introduce to you Professor Richard Butterwick-Pawlikowski, who belongs to that younger generation of specialists on Poland, dealing with Poland and Lithuania. We are grateful to be able to speak to you here through the kind invitation and offices of the Federation of Poles in Great Britain. And I mention them because we, that is, I and the Federation, share a birthday that we are 75 years old this year. I've lived with the organization and lived with the career of being a Pole in the UK since 1946, as has the Federation. So now, without further ado, we hand over to Professor Richard Butterwick-Pawlikowski.
Szanowni Państwo, dzień dobry. Thank you for the kind introduction, Jerzy. I thank the Federation of Poles very much for inviting me in such august company to say a few words on this very special occasion. The 103rd anniversary of the restoration of Poland as an independent state. Many states have appeared, disappeared, and even reappeared in the last century or so. But in the life of a nation, it isn't all that long. It's only about 4 generations: great-grandparents, grandparents, parents, and children. That's not far beyond the limits of adult memory. Perhaps there is someone watching this message with childhood memories of November 1918. You'd have to be at least 107, I suppose, but it's not impossible. Many more of you would have heard first-hand testimony about some of those events from your parents or grandparents. I use the word restoration advisedly. Restoration implies something that is legitimate and right. Old Poland, in retrospect called the First Republic, or the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, was violently destroyed by Russia, Prussia, and Austria in 1795. The old Commonwealth did not collapse, nor was it a failed state put out of its anarchic misery by better-governed neighboring monarchies. That, of course, was the narrative spread by the perpetrators of the partitions, but it has also been used as a warning by generations of Polish leaders, including Józef Piłsudski and Roman Dmowski. On the contrary, the Commonwealth was dismembered precisely because of its rapid recovery. Its vast potential to spread the ideas of liberty and the practice of citizenship across Central and Eastern Europe threatened the neighboring absolute monarchies. Their destruction of old Poland was illegitimate, despite the coerced parliamentary consent to the first 2 partitions and the royal abdication. The will and testament of the sovereign and independent Commonwealth was the Constitution of the 3rd of May 1791, the basis for Poland's other great national holiday. In 1815, the Congress of Vienna restored much of the pre-revolutionary European order in the name of legitimacy, but it did not restore more than a semblance of a small Polish state. And even that limited autonomy was soon swept away. So when Poland returned as an independent state to the map of Europe after 123 years, this long-awaited restoration was a legitimate act. But hadn't the very idea of Poland as a state and as a nation been utterly transformed during 12 to 15 decades of foreign rule? Plenty of historians, Poles as well as foreigners, have denied any significant continuity between the First and the Second Republics. Certainly, the institutions and laws of the old Commonwealth were long gone. Even the structures of the Roman Catholic Church in Poland had to be reassembled after 1918, having been split 3 ways. On the other hand, the territory, after the dust and smoke of war had cleared, was strikingly similar to that of the Commonwealth in the south, the west, and the north, a little thinner in Royal Prussia, but a little fatter in Upper Silesia. Polish territory was far less extensive in the east, but while Płock, Minsk, Żytomierz, and Kamieniec-Podolski were lost into the furnaces of the Soviet Union, Wilno, Grodno, Novogródek, Stanisławów, and of course Lwów were all part of the Second Republic. Territorially, the dependent Polish People's Republic differed more from the independent Second Republic than did interwar Poland from the Commonwealth before the First Partition. What had changed was that the Grand Duchy of Lithuania was no more, nor, of course, was the Corona Regni Poloniae, the crown of the Kingdom of Poland. Despite the efforts of the Krajowcy, or homelanders, whose traditions were valued by the late and great Zbigniew Siemaszko, the Polish and Lithuanian national movement were able to resolve their differences. So Poland and Lithuania were restored, not as a shared union, but as separate and mutually hostile states. Nevertheless, I reiterate, Poland was restored as a state. The designation of the Second Republic implies a conscious resumption of an interrupted existence, not the creation of a new one. True, Ignacy Daszyński and the socialists, who first proclaimed Polish independence in Lublin, formed the provisional government of the Republika Polska, but that name was soon jettisoned for the reassuring Rzeczpospolita Polska, the same name found in international treaties from the 18th century. Independent Poland was more than a restored state and more than a reclaimed territory. It was also a nation or a community of citizens. Here too, continuity has often been questioned, especially by those theorists who will not concede nations' existence before the 19th century. What could the old nation of nobles, about 750,000 in the late 18th century, have in common with the mass modern nation that emerged from the Great War? The latter consisted of 27 million citizens, with all adult women and men having the vote. Only a minority of the inhabitants of the Commonwealth considered themselves Poles, whereas most of the inhabitants of the Second Republic probably did. Compared to the 18th century, the idea of Polishness had become far more inclusive socially, taking in many millions of peasants, albeit quite recently. On the other hand, it had become more closely tied to the Polish language and ethnicity. Multiple identities fractured. It became harder, although not impossible, to be Polish and Lithuanian, Polish and Ukrainian, Polish and German, Polish and Jewish. These familiar arguments do not convince me, however, that the Polish nation of the 1790s was an utterly different community to that of the 1920s. In 1791, townspeople were recognized as citizens, active citizens, alongside landowning nobles. The Constitution of the 3rd of May used the word nation in an inclusive and generous sense, excluding no inhabitants of the Commonwealth. The Constitution called the peasants the most numerous and useful part of the nation. It set out a path diverted by the partitioning powers towards the end of serfdom. The trajectory was clear towards evolutionary social and political reform. That's where you were going, Poland, before you were so rudely interrupted. Despite the challenges of foreign imperial rule, most Poles, nobles and burghers, violently deprived of their citizenship in 1772, 1793, or 1795, passed on their sense of Polishness to their children, their grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren. 123 years fits within 5 generations or 2 human lifespans. Again, it's not all that long. Throughout that time, a national community and a national cause were sustained by a national culture, and for good reason. Polish has evolved continuously since the early Renaissance as a language of literature, history, and law. So, unlike some other languages in the region, it did not have to be collected by antiquarians and codified by linguists after centuries of neglect and contempt. That elite status of Polish high culture may perhaps have made it more difficult for many peasants to consider themselves Poles. It suffices to recall the massacres of Polish noble insurgents in Galicia in 1846, whose memory was still raw when Stanisław Wyspiański wrote Wesele. Yet by then, the decisive expansion of Polish identity to the peasant masses was well underway. In 1894, many peasants participated in centenary commemorations of the victory of Racławice, when Polish-speaking peasants fought and died for the homeland they shared with nobles, burghers, and Jews. Many veterans of the Kościuszko Rising were still alive in the 1850s and 1860s. They were remembered in turn by veterans of the January 1863 Rising, who enjoyed deserved respect in independent Poland. Of course, the Polish nation of the 1920s differed greatly from that of the 1790s. But then the 19th century changed the world, and not just Poland. Despite the lack of an independent Polish state, the thread of continuity between the Poles of the Commonwealth and the Poles of the Second Republic was never broken. One final question. Doesn't restoration imply someone else's gift? In 1914, Polish independence seemed unlikely. Millions of Polish soldiers served on opposing sides during the Great War. Did their efforts cancel each other out? We all know how Dmowski and Piłsudski spent most of the war in opposing camps. And then in 1917 to 18, the three partitioning empires of the Romanovs, Habsburgs, and Hohenzollerns suddenly collapsed. Moreover, the final recognition of Polish independence and most of Poland's borders was handled by the great powers. Was it all just a lucky break? Well, for starters, opportunities have to be seized, or else they drift away down the stream of history. And so they were seized with extraordinary speed and remarkable consensus. Piłsudski, Dmowski, Daszyński, Witos, and others put aside their differences when it really mattered. The Wielkopolania, the people of Greater Poland, launched the most successful Polish rising ever in the winter of 1918 to 19. Their struggle ensured that Poznań and its prosperous region became part of independent Poland. Then in 1920, a massive national effort threw back the Bolsheviks from the gates of Warsaw far to the east. Most of Poland's borders were gained by force of arms, well before the Western Allies ratified them. More importantly still, to ascribe too much to external factors would inflict a grave injustice on the memories of those 5 or so generations who strove for the Polish cause from the end of the 18th century onwards. Some did so by tenaciously farming their ancestral lands. Others built railways in South America or named mountains in Australia. Some fought as insurgents for your freedom and ours. Others worked as educators or as sanitary engineers. Others contributed as creators and patrons of that extraordinarily rich culture which still forms so much of the canon of Polish literature, music, and art. Some patriots were romantics, but others were positivists, and some adjusted their stances to advancing years and changing circumstances. Without their diverse efforts, would Poland have been worth restoring? So in 1918, Poland was not only restored, but also regained, and not without a struggle. Lest we forget,